Future Design Podcast.
This is Takatoshi Shibayama, and you're listening to the Future Design Podcast. Today, I've got Jimeno Fonseca, senior researcher from the Future Cities Laboratory, who's going to talk about smart grids and energy optimization in smart cities. Gracias por venir. Bienvenido. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Takatoshi, for the invitation. I'm very excited for being here today.
Great. You're designing future cities, and we're here to talk about what your visions are for the future. So please tell us, what is your vision for the future?
Well, that's a really big question. But in relation to what is cities and energy systems, I will say that, in the future, we're looking at a road that takes us to a more sustainable production of energy. To perhaps move away from fossil fuels resources.
Yes.
And I think that's are the current trends, which is, I think, the current guides we can see in the newspapers, what the big bodies dealing with energy questions are telling us about. And I think that's one direction in where we can go, definitely. But more than going into that direction, I think that I like to think one step back of that and basically thinking about the real short-term goals and pathways that could take us to whether it is a sustainable, let's say, society as we plan it now, or is a type of society that, although incorporates those values, also incorporates certain type of progress in any other direction, right? And what I can tell you now is not difficult to see what is the future, but what I'm going to see is that in the future of what entails energy systems and cities, we're going to look at systems that are more digitalized.
Right.
And that means systems that basically can be part of a digital and also physical world one-to-one. And I think that's something that we are doing research on since about 5 years, but also the industry is rapidly taking up on that idea. Probably you have heard about the Industry 4.0.
Sure, yes.
Which basically aims to connect every single device that exists in manufacturing, let's say, industry, with the aim of creating digital replicas or digital twins of their machines, their equipment, and then being able to look at how those machines perform today and also how they could perform in the future. And I think that some of those concepts are being taken in the energy sector. We are seeing that current research projects aim to bring these notions of digital twins for power grids, which will enable potentially to make a better operation of the system as it exists, especially in the event of volatile and uncontrollable resources. By volatile and uncontrollable resources, I refer to renewable energy such as wind power or solar energy. And I think those are some of the challenges on bringing this kind of digitalization up to a level that can be used during operations, that can bring this idea of smartness or intelligence, which is normally confused or understood as the capacity to forecast better the future and provide better insights.
Yes.
And I think we're going to see a future in which by having this digitalization, we're going to enable some intelligence in the digital world not ever seen before. And I imagine a future, if I have to say, so I imagine a future where the problem will not be about digitalizing all our infrastructure and facilitating connectivity and making it smart itself, but will be more about looking at what point in time we have to leave decisions to this digital, let's say, version of the reality, and at what time does human enter into the picture.
Right.
And I think that's what makes it really difficult to know what the future is going to look like.
Right.
Because it could become a really apocalyptic picture easily, as well as it can become a really let's say, big solution to many of the problems we have in relation to the complexity of integrating uncontrollable resources, of having multiple technologies, of having multiple people thinking about it, or multiple people consuming at different rates in different locations, and new devices, new also ways of consumption that we try to decrease. Also, but the rebound effects that come up with consumption that we don't know too much about them. There is this so known paradox called the Jevons Paradox. Maybe you have heard about that.
Yes.
Which basically just tells that the more you make efficient a system, the more you actually, instead of reducing consumption, it increases it, right?
Yes.
And we see it with vehicles, transportation. That's a normal example of making bigger highways.
Yes. And more congestion because of that.
Exactly. More people, just to reduce congestion, but at the end, just more people enables more people to use certain resource.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the initiatives we see in the energy sector is to opt for energy efficiency in buildings, in transportation, as a response to offset a little bit the picture of use of fossil fuels, but also of the emissions related to current patterns of consumption. And there will be a point in which we need to see how we can constrain that efficiency that we provide to energy systems or to consumers to a level that they don't consume any more than is expected for the sake of having a sustainable consumption of energy resources. And why I'm talking about these different points, I think they can come at different, let's say, can come separately or together. And I will say that all those questions will come together into a future, into the tipping point of who decides whether we should do energy efficient systems, or we should focus on integrating more renewable energy sources. And probably those decisions in the future will not be human-based, but will be algorithms or computer programs, which will do that. And I can see that happening at a certain point. There will be just perhaps the disruption in the timeline of where things are going to be moving on.
Yeah. So my understanding of smart cities was that in terms of energy is that there's traditional power generators that have been traditionally fueling cities, but now there's going to be different smart grids that are connecting various energy resources and delivering it to each household or building that requires it at a specific time or a specific amount. And how those smart grids are going to be created. I'm thinking, are there going to be a smart grid on each kind of block, or is it there going to be a bigger, let's say like a bigger ward where there's a smart grid that connects, like let's say 10,000 buildings around the area? I mean, how does that look?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a great question. I can tell you how it looked. I mean, until 10 years ago, I will say it looked like just a centralized system with a big plant, thousands of kilometers away. And that was since about 1900s, when the first basically long distribution power line came into place between Niagara Falls and New Jersey, right? We're talking about times of the electricity wars between Edison and Tesla and all that. And now 100 years after that, it came the idea of decentralizing all the production due to the advent of renewables and the ability of actually being able to harvest renewables close to the demand.
Yes.
Which is basically cities.
Yeah.
Where most energy consumption is actually taking place, and it will take in the future. That's something that perhaps under that, let's say, under that vision, if that vision sustains, we're thinking of how to decentralize input production more closer to the amount of resources. And on my lab, with the team I work with, we're looking at one precise scale that is not too small, so we don't go too much in detail, and just basically on developing one solution that only works for just a few, but not too big. So we get into the problem of big needs of data, big needs of assumptions of how the future is going to look like.
Right.
And that in between scale is what we call the district neighborhood scale. What in Singapore you will know as new towns.
Right.
Right. And what I could imagine is that these new towns, what it makes it interesting, at least at this point of time, to integrate microgrids, it's that they are just small enough so we can actually design them. We can go on the ground. We can see the problems. We can test the technology. Right? We can check how the demand responds to that. How actually we can see how this new energy system affects people and how people can respond to that, to not have this Jevons Paradox, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that's feasible, but also it's big enough so we can have a key, let's say, instrument to be able to integrate new technology, that is economics of scale. Right? So we can have enough consumers, we can have basically enough demand of resources, so the person or the entity who invests in new technology can actually find a business case,
Right.
to integrate renewables or any other alternative resource.
Right.
So I think, and we are seeing slowly, I think in Europe, also in Singapore, with the research we do, I can see that a lot of those ideas are being taken into place and are going to be testing in the next 5 to 10 years on seeing if that is the right scale on how these microgrids can come into place.
Right.
Something that I know for sure, they will not come into place inside just 1 or 2, 3 buildings. I think it's because of the issue of economics, just the business case is not there.
Right.
But when you have many buildings, and especially a combination between commercial and residential, that's quite crucial.
Yeah.
Then for those combinations, then you can actually have a profitable, still environmentally friendly solution to providing energy to an urban area.
Right. And then I'm assuming that there's always been a centralized power generator controlled by the government or quasi-government, and now there's going to be a lot of these private corporations coming in with their solar panels or their wind generators or any other renewable energy sources to connect to these smart grids. And I'm sure there's like a disruption happening in the energy sector for that case. And I always think that in order for these newcomers to come in, there has to be some collaboration between these companies and the government so that they're on the same ground, that they can actually make these smart grids effective for the people who are living in those districts or the cities. How is that coming along in, let's say, Singapore here?
Well, I mean, what we are saying is that, and what we understand, I mean, it's quite, I think, quite fresh. I would say this transition picking up in Singapore. I mean, there is the issue of that it's not generation, but it's more about the retailers. So now, Singapore, there are new companies who can offer you a new price of electricity to the consumer, and these companies are called retailers. And what they basically do is they buy energy from generation to different producers, and then they set up a business case in which they can offer you more competitive prices than the central operator of Singapore is offering until now. And that's the premise.
Yeah.
And well, with that premise, what we would like to incentivize or is that people think on solutions that are more economically appealing to them, right? And by raising competition, this at certain point affects the production, and then production will need to be transformed because of that competition happening in the retail market. That's something that probably we have seen in the last months, where this program of new retailers and changing to different companies.
It's happening.
It's taking place, right?
But the power generators haven't changed then.
Power generators not up to a big extent. I mean, there are a couple of companies who aim to use some roofs for provision of solar energy. But I think the most successful case comes from the Housing Development Board in Singapore. If I have to talk about a concrete example,
Mm-hmm.
in which they have 10,000, about 10,000 plus buildings under they're basically their domain, and that enables that they can think of a strategy that can be deployed to use solar energy, for example, into buildings, and then there are a lot of installations that are happening in that
Yes.
way. There is an integration of solar PV that I think is led in some part by also, I would say, the government, which tends to not be the case in other parts of the world, where this scheme of distributed energy generation, especially in the case of solar, has taken place, like in North America,
Right.
where we have really big companies, Solar City,
Yes.
that is also belongs to Elon Musk,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
To big entrepreneurs who have become bankrupt, also have got investment from many other places around the world. Now it's one of the top leading companies on solar installations
Yes.
in residential. And I think that, coming to your question, if that is changing the market and who invests on that, I think it does. There are entrepreneurs who actually invest on this and pushing the agenda for renewable production. But there are also companies who work in the oil industry who are changing their business case.
Yes. Sure.
And they have to do it. I believe companies such as Shell, for example, or BP, they have now a portfolio of wind energy and also of solar
Yes.
for residential units. And I think it's changing, like from distribution to generation, who actually is generating energy.
Yeah.
It's shifting depending on where we are.
Yeah. And I guess for the future, then we'll have all these different companies, whether they're generators or distributors, retailers, they're all going to be all connected into various grids so that energy will be sent over to the cities and there won't be even people actually deciding whether they want it from this company or not. It's all the smart grid deciding which is more cost effective to buy from the company A than company B, and what time they should be consuming that energy.
Yeah, I mean, the way it works is like an optimization problem, and it's actually an algorithm who decides at every point of time which generator needs to produce from where point, right? And then that happens. But once we need to go to customers, there is the opportunity of buying that source of energy that has certain price, that is basically the mix of all those generators, and then sell it to different customers at different prices, right? It's just the best way to compare it is to a distribution of milk, for example. So
Right.
you have farmers all around the different cities in a country,
Yes.
right? Different neighborhoods. Let's say if it were Singapore, but
Right.
and they basically just sell the milk at certain price, and then there is somebody who processes the milk. There's somebody who distributes it, and there is somebody retail who actually sells it, and they have the advantage that as they are close to the consumer, they have more margin to negotiate what price that milk is gonna be. And probably we will see that happening again. But I mean, the only thing that is not clear is how it's gonna work when we have major penetration of solar energy, which comes at a marginal cost, basically a cost per unit of energy that is zero, basically. It's just close to zero versus a generator that uses natural gas. I mean, they have several dollars per megawatt they have to power.
Right.
And then how does it become fair? How this decision of the optimization algorithm who looks for the lower price of the grid?
Yeah.
That's not clear still.
Right. Or I guess it also depends on how much demand is there in that certain district or city as well. Obviously, a lot of solar panels or wind generators wouldn't be enough to fuel the whole city, so they obviously will have to go for traditional resources to continue buying from dirty energy power plants as well, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what is happening, and I mean, one of the crucial issues, I think there will be also a tipping point. I mean, depends a lot on the transportation sector, which once it becomes electrified, then it will become a huge load into the system of electricity generation, and that could take one direction, or took two directions actually. Either incentivizes more solar energy being bought and traded, more clean energy to attend that demand, or it just incentivizes the whole industry from resources such as natural gas or crude oil to put more of it into the market. And I think that will depend on how fast this increase into demand is going to be, because I imagine people basically fighting against the fear of whether having or not enough energy.
Yeah.
And I think that could become the tipping point that can actually exponentially rise the use of actually more fossil fuels than clean energy.
Right. Yeah, because I've read that by 2050, 68% of the population of this world is going to be living in urban cities, and that's going to drive up a lot of the energy demand as well. On top of that, we're going to have more electric vehicles, more smart devices, and it's going to be looking like so much more energy consumption than what we're consuming at the moment. So obviously, there's going to be a need for more energy generation. Whether it be from traditional resources or renewables. I mean, obviously, it's going to be exponentially much bigger.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, and just to note, to remember that a lot of, I think, about 20% of the world also doesn't have access to electricity, and in certain locations that means millions of people. And now, how do they, let's say, use energy from? Let's say that is a question that probably we will need to solve in the next 5 to 10 years. So to see that demand doesn't explode basically beyond the capabilities of local resources and technology and specifically business cases. I think the problem is the barrier is always the business case,
right?
As I mentioned at the beginning. And that's why the scale of this district was interesting, because it made a business case, but not itself the demand and supply you can get in the districts. It's more about the economics.
Right. And can these smart cities expand out of the city as well into kind of suburban or rural settings as well?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, yes. In theory, I mean, one of the interesting parts of using these microgrids and decentralized production is that for those retired areas, really let's say suburban or more rural areas, they can actually be self-sufficient,
right,
in the amount of energy they consume.
Right.
But the interesting part is that hasn't been that is not a surprise,
right,
nowadays. If we look at regions, for example, in the Amazons,
yes,
right, there are really small communities who, since the 70s, they use solar panels and one diesel generator to provide electricity to the entire community.
Right.
And of course, because it's a limited resource, let's say in terms of they only have it when the sun shines, and they have to actually use this resource properly. That, of course, limits the amount of development they could have in terms of industry. Right? It's impossible to make a manufacturing industry there in those areas. So, I mean, to see it from the other perspective, I think that has been something that has been thought and exists already.
Yes.
But now the idea is how we can have that decentralized generation, but also have the status of living of modern cities such as Singapore, right? That has a really high level of consumption versus those small villages in the Amazons who are perhaps 80% using renewable energy.
Right.
But their status of living, I will dare to say, that is significantly lower than the one that we enjoy here.
But can that kind of increase the quality of life? If we have more modernized and smart cities, can that help to increase the living standards of these rural areas as well?
I mean, well, if it is about energy technology, I would say the problem is not about the technology itself. It's more about, because people, the common users do not see that technology, right? It's underground, it's hidden, and the less you see it, the less you will care about it. You also, people do not train to care about the energy itself as an artifact, as a good or a service. It's more about thinking of whether I have light or I don't have light, of whether I have my cell phone or not. Basically, if I had the service that electricity enables. And I think that as soon as you have it, people wouldn't care if you have it, but they will care if they don't have it.
Right.
Not where they have it from.
Sure.
And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why it's so complicated to change people's minds in terms of integration of renewable energy sources. It's quite intangible. It's quite difficult to.
It's true. I mean,
understand.
for any type of infrastructure, whether it's like water or electricity too, but nobody really cares where it's coming from. Nobody on our daily lives think, oh, is it coming from a nuclear power plant or is it coming from a solar panel? And you just go about your lives thinking, you just have energy. I mean, the energy itself doesn't have a tag on it that says, made by, solar panels, right? So, nobody really, tends to care where it's from, but as long as you have it. And I think for the rural areas, because rural depends on where rural is, how you define that. Rural in like the Amazon areas and rural in let's say Japan is completely different.
Which might be actually urban already.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. It's too difficult to.
Yeah, but I mean, if you can start getting these, let's say, sub-Saharan countries or even in Amazon or something, these rural areas to have more energy because of this, this new technologies coming in, and that could be a way to increase inclusion into more of our society as well. So that's kind of what I was thinking is like, can these smart cities really expand out beyond cities into all corners of the world, and that would be like something interesting to really see in the future. Not just the cities.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that the forecast is that most of the people are going to be living into cities in the future.
Yeah.
The interesting part about Asia is that that's the case today.
Yes.
Right. In Europe, we have still some rural areas, which I will say that they are not that rural. They have, as soon as they have, to me, if they are 100% 24/7 water, waste management, and electricity is not a rural area anymore.
Yeah.
But let's say they are rural, and what it brings the question is that if cities, if most of people are living already in cities in Southeast Asia, right? And we see the trend of agricultural land becoming more urbanized, all those things. Inherently, that expansion between this, let's call it the smart city, or because smart city would be a slogan for today, right? That helps to have the discussion rolling, or whatever that version of city would be, of progress that we want to see in the future, of intelligence, for sure will expand to almost be on the lives of every single person in the world.
Well, the thing is, it doesn't have to be a city itself, right? It could be smart agriculture. So if a lot of people are actually leaving this farmed areas and moving into cities, the self-dependency of a nation goes down in terms of food. But if we have smart agriculture and, a lot of devices and smart tractors and all these things can work by itself autonomously, then countries don't have to mind if people are actually migrating into cities, right?
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, one of the main, main issues I think that also research is tackling is this connection between energy, food, and water. This nexus, they call it. And because once we think about food production, which at the end is also energy, right?
Yes.
It's stored into calories,
Sure.
whatever method we assess it. Then it starts to become part of the bigger problem of how we secure energy for the future in different nations, because depending on that is that our food production is going to depend. But depending on where that food production comes from is where the energy needs to be actually required from. So that kind of situation actually makes it, I think, one of the problems that we were going to be seeing in the future on how to make sure that it's a good decision that we bring all people into the city and that we can actually automate all the processes that give us food, right?
Yes.
With the resources, hopefully renewable resources that we have, which will be good and bad, I will say. I mean, if we get into the topic of food, I mean, there is a really big rabbit hole in terms of, I mean, that potentially could be one of the biggest and less invested areas of research in regards to their impact to the consumption of energy and also emissions of CO2. I mean, we know now that agriculture is perhaps one of the biggest sectors that produces more emissions of CO2, right? Consumes vast amount of energy that can be used for other purposes. But still, we need this food production at the levels that we require at this point, right? And increasing the efficiency of those processes doesn't mean, again, there is this Jevons Paradox, doesn't mean that we're gonna save. Maybe there is more people who actually can have food, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that question about whether it's good to automate all the agriculture and farmland is good or not. I think it's quite difficult. It depends on how it's planned, of course, how it's thought about, and more specifically is if it is automated, what basically enables technology to take good decisions, right? On how to allocate food production resources to cities, for example. Let's suppose a future where actually the allocation of one resource of, like, let's say milk or any dairy products or just vegetables is decided by a computer, and that depends on the price, or will depend on what exactly, right? And what if it gets it wrong? What if it decides the most efficient thing is to give food to people who are educated and not to people who are not educated, because they can generate more progress if that is the objective of how it's trained,
or it could be taking inventory samples from different supermarkets or restaurants and feeding it back to the farmlands and saying, well, let's say in a certain amount of period, this is the total consumption of tomatoes, so let's plant X amount for the following year or something. I mean, that could be something that I could totally see that's automated as well.
Yeah, I believe so. Like the small, I mean, the small tasks which actually could provide insights to improve the production. But that's the issue. It's like, okay, let's automate it. Let's have more production of tomatoes, and if the algorithm does it right, then we have more tomatoes for the restaurants. And at a certain point, because it's so efficient, people like to make it even more efficient and try to distribute it more, the tomatoes, to more people, which will lead to more consumption unless it's regulated. Let's suppose that algorithm fails to do it, right? So then we have shortage. Then we have inflation into the price of tomato. Then we have less access to tomato. And then there will be segregation. Just to put an example, that could happen at every level of the supply chain of food, but as well can happen in the supply chain of energy.
That's amazing. I mean, that becomes completely like an economic policy decision that needs to be kind of automated as well, that's connected to all the other algorithms that are deciding, down to a total production of tomatoes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I mean, then it comes back to this question is, at what point should humans take decisions and override those decisions taken by computer programs that we have trained, let's say, at the base of our knowledge? Let's suppose that we made these algorithms that are so smart that can provide you insights and recommendations about where to go. It controls your decisions about which movies to see,
Yeah.
controls your decisions about what food to get,
Yeah.
what dresses to wear,
Yeah.
and to which party to vote.
Right. Yeah.
So we
Well,
don't need to imagine it, right?
Yeah.
It already has
Well,
has
I mean,
happened.
Yeah, I mean, there's now, let's say, city of Singapore. Then there's a lot of cameras all over the city, and those are things to like track traffic. But now, what if it's starting to use it for tracking criminal activity, or whether, like in Singapore, if you even spit on the floor or throw a cigarette butt onto the street, that's a penalty. It's a penalty, right? I mean, so if all these cameras can start monitoring your everyday activity, that's also something that we should really be scared of, right? I mean, it's a surveillance city, but also on the flip side of that, I mean, it does help control keeping the city cleaner, monitoring traffic so that you have an efficient traffic light systems and all these things. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. So now you're working with Singapore Smart City, right? So could you tell us like what kind of things that you're doing with this Smart Cities laboratory?
Yeah, well, at the Future Cities Laboratory, I work in the area of creating the next generation of decision support systems for energy systems. Basically, decision support systems are like computer programs that helps you to hopefully take better decisions, right? Like shows you about the limitations, the pros and the cons of certain technology, right? We talk about solar, wind, right? Fossil fuels, and helps you to understand what would be the positive and negative effects. So you take the better decisions. The assumption is that the more information we present, and if we can show that information in certain meaningful way, then better decisions energy experts can take, right? So that's the premise. And today we got up to a level of creating software that has been used or in academia, but now is slowly entering into the energy planning industry to see how to create scenarios or create visions at the district scale. So again, at that scale, on how future new towns in Singapore can look like, and what energy infrastructure will be needed in terms of how much renewable makes sense, in terms that it makes is effective in terms of costs, but also that attends the targets that the authorities have in terms of reducing emissions and also reducing energy consumption. And as we discussed, I mean, this kind of problem has a lot of levels of decisions. We need to decide not only the technology, but also the manufacturer, and then it increases. If we add to that is the scale, so how many buildings, right? What's the size? That's another decision. Just decisions as where to locate the pipelines or the cabling,
Right.
also can have an impact on the economics of this. So we created a software that is called the City Energy Analyst to provide this kind of analysis.
Right.
And this is where we are. But I believe that now the question is where are we heading to with this,
exactly.
right?
Yes.
It's about this. And I'm starting to see that at certain point, because of how complex all these questions about deciding what is the best technology to invest on, what is the best mix of resources. Let's talk not about one technology, but a mix. And at what time invest on it. It depends a lot on the time, right?
Right.
The price can change on the time, and also the targets can change. So all those decisions are so complex that I can see more and more that computer systems actually helps you to understand this phenomena in a faster manner as current consultants can do, right? So for example, let's give you an example. Using this city energy analyst and the databases that we can collect from it, we have reduced about from 2 years of surveying locations in terms of buildings and also the infrastructure of sites to about 1 or 2 weeks
Right.
You can automate it just really quickly. All the data collection that you need, and then do the analysis, the optimization algorithms. They can do it quite quickly, and they can present you options. Right. And this is where we are in terms of research.
Yeah.
Maybe in a couple of years, that type of technology can get widespread into the market.
Right.
But what I see is that even if it makes it to the market, these things widespread, there is still a problem, and that is that these technologies are quite powerful to create options, right? And create alternatives on how a good future can be, how to take better decisions. But they can easily create so many decisions, so many possibilities that experts can become overwhelmed, and at the end thinking, "Oh, this is going to be too complicated. Better we just do what we have done in the last 10 years."
Right.
And I think that scares me because it's not only me, but I think it's a couple of labs also around the world, research groups who are really taking really serious this question on how we help experts that actually are moving into this more intelligent energy sector.
Yes.
How we actually convince them, or not convince them, but how actually our work transforms into actions.
Right.
And just to put it into that conclusion, on that question, how our work transforms into action.
Yes.
I will say that if we think about that question and how to solve it, then there is one main concept that is called expert systems.
Expert systems.
Expert systems. So probably you haven't heard about it.
No.
No, right? But I'm pretty sure you use it this morning or you use it during the last week. So expert systems are basically is an area of research from artificial intelligence, which basically entails having a computer program that imitates human intuition and also decision making, right?
Right.
And there are different examples of this type of expert systems. One is a recommendation system, such as the one that Netflix uses,
Right.
To understand what is your pattern of behavior of movies that you like, and then decide for you some recommendations.
Yeah.
Right. There are also other systems that are called monitoring systems that are starting to be used in industry to understand questions like, when should I maintain this equipment?
Right.
When should I turn it off? If I turn it off in 10 days, will I save a lot of money, or will I actually endanger the whole use of the system?
Right.
And these kind of, let's say, expert systems aim to tap on a lot of information and knowledge base about the past, right? Conditions, about connecting patterns from today with other, let's say, people, or if we talk about energy systems, about other equipment, connecting other equipment that has had certain maintenance schedules, and based on that, learning when your equipment, if your operator, is going to fail.
Right.
Or coming from recommending you movies based on how your friends watch movies on Netflix, and then understanding that you're a friend with this person, so you're more likely, there's a pattern that you're going to like this movie, and you're going to interact with him.
Right.
And those kind of things is something that is going to be, we see that they are actually taking place in different industries. I just mentioned the video streaming industry.
Sure.
But I see that at a certain point we will need to talk about those expert systems for the energy sector.
Right.
And the question why we need to talk about them in the future is not because they can actually automate a lot of things and they can help you to analyze things better and actually take decisions for us. It's not about that in influence and actions. The issue, and the most scary issue, is that if we don't do it, and the academia doesn't do it, and the government doesn't do it with good intentions, there will be a problem that these algorithms will be invented and will provide perhaps deceiving decisions that we have to protect ourselves from.
Right.
And this is quite crucial because you cannot believe it, but these cell phones, they actually play a significant role in all the decisions that you take during the day.
Right.
And this little guy is actually probably the guy who will take us to decide whether we need to go for fossil fuels or we need to go for renewable energy generation, consumer side.
Yeah.
And I think if we manage to create those expert systems in the energy sector, which can provide the best advice based on what society needs. It brings more value added, unbiased value added, right? Controls all those harms that can and rebound effects. Then potentially we can actually reach the level of intelligence and progress that we need.
Right.
Probably we're really far away from that.
Right.
But I think it's the time that we start thinking on not anymore looking at decision support systems, which is the state of the art of just providing you ideas to experts and saving you time. It's more about how actually either we influence your decision or we avoid that algorithms with bad intentions, which will always exist, which will pursue the agenda of somebody else, actually do it and actually steer you in one or another way.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, there's many corporations or governments would want to tweak that algorithm so that, they want to make you do certain things for them rather than for yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's a double-edged sword with this technology is that you think you're free thinker, but you're not, right? And you're always, affected by somebody else's decision or some ad that you see or whatever it is that's surrounding you, and you're not actually liberated from all that stuff, and you're kind of, you're a prisoner of those surrounding, bodies of the people thinking, this is the way you should think. I guess, even simple things like what should I watch tonight on Netflix or what should I listen to on Spotify? I mean, all these algorithms are telling you this is what you should watch. This is what you should listen to. Right?
Exactly.
And then I guess in a bigger context of like smart cities, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but maybe I could be walking down cities and then maybe your gadget or some ad is like blasting on you saying, oh, maybe you should go this way because, they want to steer you into a shop or a certain location that's more beneficial for them, telling you to do it rather than you deliberately thinking that you should make a right turn or something.
Yeah, I mean that could be one way to see it. However, there's one intrinsic need of the human being and experts to take decisions, and probably for you too is the issue of trustworthiness, on credibility. And it's not the same if you, for example, you search an engine like Google, for example, that is widespread now, that you have used it so many times and it gives you good results, that you use one of the competition. You inherently are most likely to not trust that one of the competition.
Right.
And one of the reasons is because people who actually have done research in what is called human-machine interfaces, actually there's research on looking at that connection between humans and devices, have seen that once one computer program itself, one accessory, even your cell phone, this one exclusively with this tape, everything, it gives me good decisions and or good recommendations of what we should do. The more I start actually trusting in it as if we're a person. But not other computer.
Right.
Even if I use the phone and another phone that I don't know, and I search for a recommendation, I would prefer the one that my phone gives me.
Right.
Or that my Facebook gives me versus the Facebook of another person. It's a weird, let's say, cognitive, a problem. Not weird. It's interesting cognitive problem, but it's important because at the end it could be this little guy. You trust the most, who is actually be telling you where I should go next.
Right.
And probably there are many people now. We mentioned about the retail market of energy, in the energy sector, and most people, I think the first thing that they did was to take their phone and ask their question: what should be to which company should I move on? Should I shift or not? Advantages and disadvantages. And look at that. So, and then what if that, that work becomes manipulated in a direction? It could be in a really good direction or in a bad direction. And so it just basically tells you that these little guys are going to influence in most of the decisions we take. And even in the energy sector, we need to get into it to form this kind of intelligence that is necessary to move a broader agenda of a sustainable living.
then who do you think should be programming these algorithms in order to feel confident that they're a trusted third party, that they're not manipulating in judgment, that they're not actually giving me the best price for my energy then?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's. I mean, for the time being, I think. I mean, some of the. I mean, I can talk for the public institution that I represent, right? I mean, as long as we keep our judgment based on values such as integrity, accountability, fairness, and transparency,
Yeah.
which is probably values that agree with the institution I represent, I think whoever does it under those values can help us to move into a safe direction. Right? But not needless to say, everything is subjected to a personal bias, to misconceptions, or to the person behind it. And I think that's one of the most difficult parts. I think it's as you say, it's the question who programs it. And
those 4 or 5 words that you just used to describe the institution. Investment banks use that as well.
You see, it's difficult even if. Exactly. It's I mean, even if we go into that direction and we say that we are as neutral as possible, there's always going to be this social bias, cognitive bias on what we expect to gain out of it, right? There's always a value for us. So to finding that match, I think the question at the end will be we'll be asking, does this algorithm matches the perceived value of progress of society as whole? Does it? No. Learn again.
Right.
Does this algorithm doesn't? It doesn't do it. Then do it again, and let's train it again. But then, what that perception of value is difficult to understand, because if value is about integrating renewable energy, and the algorithm does it and gives you all the recommendations to go into that direction. It could be that at the end, that integration massively of renewable energy today could have been easier in the future when we have better technology and lower prices. Just to give an example. So even if we manage to do algorithms that can think better than us and provide us better options, and they provide it safely, then are they going to be still taking decision that we don't regret, right? So, but I think the more we study about that, the more we can learn about it. It's a big Pandora box, I think, that is going to open. But we need to check it out because sooner or later that's going to be used for the good or bad intentions.
Right. And what drives you to do this? Do what you're doing at the moment? I mean, what is your background? What made you the person you are today?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I have a really mixed background, extremely mixed background. I mean, I'm Latin American. I have my own biases for my culture. I went to Italy and studied a career that was not actually in line with my first graduate studies. I then went to Switzerland, experimenting in other culture, my doctoral degree in another field completely. And I think from what I learned from all these experiences, from working in multiple cultural environments, with people coming from design background, people coming from engineering, for environmental sciences, and actually put them all together to work for something, I also have understood that it's too difficult to take decisions and good decisions.
Right.
Everybody has a different perspective, and to move an agenda that actually can help us to have more affordable energy, to avoid wars based on oil and resources, to have still a future that we can be proud of for our children and our society. We need to look at how to influence decisions in the best way of the real actors.
Sure.
And what it makes it interesting for me is that those actors have as diverse backgrounds as I have, as different ways to see the problem, but we have the opportunity today to connect them.
Yeah.
To put, just to tell you, I mean, the software we created is the first one in which you can connect urban designers who are basically kind of professionals who are dedicated to coming from the design background on how to portray a vision into basically an image of the city, and connect also energy expert engineers together to form a version of a city that looks as good as we expect it to be, but also underlying the surface, it has the systems that take us to a more sustainable living and an affordable living. And that's kind of the things that I'm trying to achieve, to connect those disciplines in a meaningful way, so we can create more knowledge and contribute to I mean, this value added, which I would say goes in the direction of making a better, more efficient management of natural resources.
Yeah.
Let's say that's so. That's my main motivation. How we can make this efficient management of resources, and how we can connect by connecting different disciplines to digital technologies, and be able to influence good decisions for the future.
Right. And how do you think, the Singapore project that you're working on, how long do you think it will take for us to for everybody to be on this smart grid that you're designing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, that's, it's difficult to say, but I would say that the technology itself exists. It's being tested more. And I think it's just a matter of 5 to 10 years that we start designing with this type of technologies, that it becomes the accepted standard, at least for providing options.
Right.
Perhaps not influencing and changing decisions. At least providing options that are more sustainable than what we exist. And that will happen in 5-10 years. Something that could happen in the long term is that vision of expert systems, of really moving a little bit more into the direction of instead of going into a software, doing simulations and doing engineering design and calculations, which is the software that we produce. Instead of that, you will just make a question of, should I invest in renewable now for my rooftop?
Yeah.
And it will just do the calculations all automatically, and give you a recommendation, and give you the pros and the cons, and how it affects you, and how it affects the agenda of everyone. And probably that's what will happen perhaps in, I don't know, just a short 15-20 years time.
Yeah, I guess with the other technologies as well, where like more smart electronic vehicles start coming on, the 5G rollout and how that impacts IoT as well should be a huge factor in the development of what you're doing as well, right?
Oh yeah, you touch a really good point. I mean, besides faster streaming of movies and gaming, as people basically sell 5G,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, it will bring so much power to the kind of communications, the speed that we need to actually provide recommendations at the level of technical detail needed for these decisions to take place. And I think that will enable a lot of things. I mean, everything that connects more the world and faster. I mean, it can lead to many more possibilities to develop these systems.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for that time to come. There's all these devices that are still not connected, and it's still. I'm waiting to see this rollout of 5G and how that would connect all our devices, and what new stuff that we can see coming out of it. And obviously energy is one part of that as well, because it's no longer would I want to see like a utility bill fluctuating so much depending on my usage, but you still they're charging me like a fixed cost, right? And I want to see something that's a lot more stable and transparent of how I'm consuming my energy, and then finding the right price for getting that energy, and then as we all consume more that bill is going to get more and more expensive. And obviously, we can't be spending thousands of dollars on electricity just because technology has advanced, right? I mean, if technology has become cheaper to buy, let's say, all these connected devices, then energy cost has to come down with it. Otherwise, we won't be able to sustain all these devices that we have. And still at the cost that I'm paying for my utility bills at home, which with devices that are not even connected, and I don't even own a electronic vehicle, I still think it's way too high already. So how can I sustain it when I get all these things?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, but again, it's a question for me. I'm the guy who tries to influence the way you actually consume and try to make possible that at the end energy efficiency is attained. Then I mean that picture will trends to increase actually the consumption of energy.
Yeah.
And it has to do a lot with something that people in behavioral science call the anchor points.
Right.
And it's basically saying that based on where you are now, on
Right.
how much money you have, then your decision will depend on that amount of money you have.
Right.
And that's why decisions of a student who actually is paying his student loan will be completely different than a person who actually has millions in the bank.
Right.
On how to actually save energy or not. And that makes it quite difficult.
Also depends on how connected you are to the world as well, right? I mean, in the future, then I'm guessing, because if I'm a student, or even if I'm a worker, still paying my student loans, and I don't have disposable income to sustain all these things that we all going to have in the future, compared to a millionaire or a billionaire who has enough disposable income to have whatever gadgets and cars and all these things and all connected. You're going to have a very big disparity on your social activities in this connected world, I guess.
Yes, I mean, and well, that's another issue, right?
Yeah.
We call about equity,
Yeah.
quality equity, and how we can just make the gap smaller,
Yeah.
income gap is smaller, right, than bigger, right, and
Yeah.
make that disposable income kind of fair,
Yeah.
have that parity.
Yeah, and I guess you just want energy costs to be as cheap as possible to, at least that's one element of something of your life that you want to make it as cheap as possible, that it's widely equitable to everybody in the world.
But it's probably, as you say, just one of the many other
Yeah.
things that are important
Yeah.
in life, and
Yeah.
how much percentage of that influences your actually your living is to be discussed, right? And I think all those issues and all those complexities that range from consumer behavior to the technology and policies are going to be into place is what makes it really difficult to forecast the future and to provide a vision that actually is congruent with the complexity that we have now. Right?
Yeah, big topics. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I had a really wonderful time, and hope we could do a episode, whatever, together again. And maybe you can give us some updates on what you're doing in the future.
Yeah, definitely. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for
thank you
having
very
me.
much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Future Design Podcast.